Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Dustin Guastella. He's the Director of Operations for Teamsters 623. He's also part of Philadelphia DSA, and he writes regularly for Jacobin Magazine. His new piece, We Need Class War, Not a Culture War, has just been published, and we're going to be talking about that among other important topics. Dino, thanks so much for doing this, man. How are you?
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Always a pleasure. So this piece, I guess, is a reply to a piece that Angela Nagel and Michael Tracy put out critiquing the Sanders campaign. And I want to just, before we get to the disagreements, I mean, what do you think generally, like, what did they get right in that piece? Did they, what did they get right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they got, it was an attempt at a postmortem that looked heavily at the messaging aspect of the Sanders campaign and looked at that comparing 2020 to 2016. And I think some of what they got right, and I said this in the piece, is that they did notice something significant, which is that the contemporary left, what is an unfortunate phrase for it, but the woke politics of the contemporary left is somewhat alienating, right? And it does drive voters away. And I think they accurately assess that that's a true thing that happens in political campaigns. Where I think they went wrong is that I don't think Bernie was really that candidate, and I don't think Bernie's loss can really be attributed in any significant way to that kind of posturing or that kind of rhetoric. So what they got right was this fault line in American politics is important, and it is divisive, and it can be costly for the left. And I think it certainly was for a candidate like Elizabeth Warren, or all the candidates that sort of tried to play kind of ultra woke left, feign left, ultra woke posture. They all did very badly. But I just think when it comes to Sanders, that falls on deaf ears. I don't think it's true for Sanders. I think there are a million reasons why, and we can get into that. But yeah, I mean, that's what I think they were trying to do.
So yeah, and we'll get into that. So then the other kind of really big part of the argument generally, which I think can be relatively easily cleared up, and I guess I'll just state it and see if you agree with me. I think people like you and I, and certainly I thought that Bernie Sanders had a chance of winning. I thought that there was, I don't know, and I think I've actually said this, in real time, 20%, 25%. So not in any ways a slam dunk, but an unparalleled opportunity to elect somebody with that kind of politics to the most important political office in the world. So you take advantage of that. And I think, and there were differences too, but I mean, I certainly felt a lot of frustration that, people were definitely fucking around with other candidates. And I think the rhetoric and the idea of pushing him to the left, quote unquote, was ludicrous and absurd and just, huge amount of problems, particularly in these sort of zones. I don't know how much they kind of translate necessarily to the door-to-door. And at the same time, it's not that he never, I think when people say, look, he never could have won, obviously that's ridiculous. We wouldn't have put the energy that we could have put in. And I think that is a cop-out. I think they're right to call it a cop-out. At the same time, this counter-narrative that all of the traditional laws of politics apply. He's the Democratic runner-up last time. He raised a lot of money. Look, yeah, he did raise a lot of money. And how that money was spent and, the strategic choices that were made, absolutely valid areas for criticism and interrogation. But just on this very simple point of how much of a sort of slam dunk this was going to be, I think we got to be real, both in terms of not just saying, oh, it never could have happened, so we don't have to improve our game. And I think that's a very problematic discourse. But then on the other hand, the idea that just, this was like any other sort of Democratic candidate riding on a wave of being runner-up. No, obviously not. And I don't think any of us thought that, even when we were at our most optimistic.
Right. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's like, the way I would think about it is, first, you have to preface it by saying there's no such thing as a perfect campaign, because politics is not, a science. It's an art, right? So you read, what you can do in the moment. You're constantly changing what you can do. But the way that we can put it in a way to sort of avoid the trap of saying there's nothing we could have done, this is it, this was all it was ever going to be, is to say in a game where the balance of forces is so stacked against us, we have to be as close to perfect as possible. And this was something that FDR's advisors used to always say. They would say that, we were perfect campaigners. They didn't make mistakes on the campaign trail. And so insofar as there's an argument, you can say we made mistakes, right? And you can identify innumerable mistakes that were made throughout the entire campaign, whatever, right? But that to leap from had we fixed those mistakes, the kind of if only, shoulda, coulda, woulda, to we would have cakewalked through the election, that to me is a leap we can't take, right? So we can say in the fires of a campaign, like, look, we shouldn't have done this, we should have done this, blah, blah, blah. But when you try to extrapolate that from, those little mistakes, the tweaks here and there, and act as if that negates the immense structural power that we're going up against, I think that's a leap. And it's a dangerous leap because it suggests that the process of politics is internal to the political leaders themselves. That if only they made the right choices, then victory is within reach, right? And I said this about the 1983 campaign, the UK Labour campaign, I think it rings true for a lot of defeats, which are, you could do everything right. You could get every single thing right on the campaign trail, in your party, you can somehow manage to run a spectacular, perfect, tight ship throughout the entire campaign and still lose. And so we have to be prepared for understanding the dynamics between a politics that ultimately does not reward our side very often, extremely rare, especially in democratic cases. I mean, how many times has a democratic socialist won government anywhere in the world? It's incredibly rare. So we have to take stock of that while also being critical of the challenges that be. So yeah, Bernie could have won. We could have run a perfect campaign. There could have been a lot of different things that aligned differently. Somehow the DNC could have not gotten their act together. These external forces could have aligned to make things work. We could have pumped out those infrequent voters and really turned out the base that we wanted to turn out. But it didn't happen that way. And a lot of that was not the fault of the campaign. A lot of that was totally external to the campaign. And I think we have to keep that in mind in order to understand what we're up against and what we're trying to do.
Right. I mean, I think it is, though, really, really important to underline where I disagree. I mean, one area, I don't even want to get into the whole Russiagate stuff. But I mean, look, I think clearly the critics of Russiagate have been more validated than the people who have been sympathetic to Russiagate and in terms of the overall balance sheet of that story. And at the same time, I did think, writing a piece that correctly said this campaign was way overindulgent of like online discourse that had nothing to do with what normal voters of any background want. I agree with that completely. I think it's 100% valid criticism. And then also at the same time saying, that, Bernie should have been like, Russiagate's a hoax. I mean, unfortunately, guys, bad news. The same people who are going to roll their eyes at kind of woke shit are, some of those same people are totally convinced that Trump is a KGB agent. So if we're going to have a conversation about what is politically real, then it's got to be a conversation about what's politically real. And the one I use all the time that implicates me is like, yeah, I would like Americans to have a good relationship and understanding, at least be able to historicize Fidel Castro. But no, presidential frontrunner should not be talking about, and I should not be explaining Fidel Castro's real record weeks before votes are happening. This is a strategic mistake. So I think so again, even if it's only 10, 15% internal, all the more reason there can't be any fuck ups. And there were definitely fuck ups, and some of them they identified. Do you think, though, that it gets to like a kind of bigger contradiction that I see about how Bernie's talked about? And it's funny because it crossed even, I think, both sides inside the campaign, which was that at times you had one contingent that was very into this like revolution discourse. And then on the other, which could, again, I think totally, I mean, I'll say anecdotally, like my grandma in Florida, she likes Bernie. That, she liked the FDR stuff, not the revolution stuff. And at the end of the day, she was comfortable with Biden, right? Like that very much exists. And, And then on the other hand, I think there were actually people in the other part of the campaign who might have been more sort of conventionally aligned with the Democratic Party, who I didn't think actually fully anticipated how much Bernie was going to be resisted, how much he was going to be hated by the donor class and by the corporate class. And you saw this weird parallel in the sort of sub-left conversation, because on one hand, it was sort of like, you know, revolution, 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 Bernie, Bernie, Bernie. And then other people saying like, yeah, you know, this is just like FDR. You know, like, yeah, just like FDR, you know, no big deal there. Not like programs that still help people today were created in that era. But besides rolling my eyes at the nonsense of that, you know, people had a way, I think, of misjudging in both directions, where they either looked at his program and they said, because it's not like a call to, you know, collectivize the means of production, it's just social democracy, and therefore it's not that big of a deal, and therefore it's not that much of a threat. Versus other people that really hyped certain languages that could have been popularly alienating, while maybe soft pedaling that in today's political environment, even Medicare for all alone is an enormous threat to the most powerful sectors of our society, and they acted accordingly.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, you know, to your point, the challenge for any presidential candidate is they have to be able to find that line in real time. You know what I mean? They have to be able to find out what part of what they're saying is really resonating with their base. And I think Bernie actually did a really good job at that, better than a lot of people are willing to give him credit for. He was able to keep together a coalition of people that, you know, otherwise never really would come together, right? So I think he did a really good job of identifying the issues, and I think Medicare for All was the cornerstone one, that no matter how revolutionary you want to think you are, privatizing nearly 1/5 of the American economy, socializing 1/5 of the American economy for the benefit of public health, that's not chicken shit. Just because other countries have it, just because in other countries it's not a leap, doesn't mean it wouldn't create a full-scale capitalist response, right? So what he was doing was, and you know, you and I have talked about this before, getting into the nitty-gritty of like whether he was revolutionary or whether he was really a socialist is really missing the point. And if that's what you're interested in, I think you have a lot to learn about politics. Because for us, the goal is to get working class people together on the basis of a shared economic interest to act politically, collectively, right? In their interest. If you're worried about certain words and phrases that are being used all the time but whether or not somebody's revolutionary enough or whether or not they're really a socialist or something like this, you're missing whether or not you're getting at the point, right? And I think Bernie, by the standards of American politics, was way out on left field and yet mainstreamed his politics very, very well. So, you know, to me, the question of whether or not he was a revolutionary or whether or not we should be pumping up the revolutionary side of it, it's like, no, not really. What we should have been, you know, what Bernie did was what Bernie should have done, which was emphasize a legacy of FDR, emphasize Medicare for all, emphasize a rootedness in, you know, the American political context, which shows that he after all, he's running to be the leader of the country. He can't act as if he doesn't understand the basic political parameters of the country. It would totally make him, you know, anathema to most voters. Most voters are not leftists who think in ideological terms. They want somebody who's going to be a leader, who's going to actually provide something for them, who's going to win something and do something for them. So if you're looking at from the perspective of most voters, they're not sitting there with a checklist looking at these different candidates and seeing whether they tick all the right ideological boxes. They're taking a kind of broad sweep, pulling in all this information and trying to make a decision based off what they have. In that context, Bernie did very well. I mean, Bernie and Biden were the two most liked contenders from the beginning of the race to the end of the race.
Yep.
Which says he did really, really well. And I think that it's really hard to downplay how successful the Sanders campaigns were in terms of mainstreaming a kind of politics and a thought process that has not been visible on the left for a really long time.
Is there a third way? I use that intentionally. I know this will trigger a bunch of people, but it's like I see one, you know, I get the pushback when people talk about the ground that has been made in the last couple of years, because it's like, also not really, right? Like Bernie lost these 2 races. There's a lot of fanfare about, certain folks elected to Congress. Predominantly in 2018, the people got elected to Congress were like literally former CIA agents that found Donald Trump distasteful. And so it's like, and Bernie lost his share. He actually didn't perform as well this time as he did in some ways in 2016. So I get the sort of like, hey, if this is winning, I don't want to know what losing looks like. Now, and so basically, I'll just put it there. What's the sort of answer to that, as we still really are very significantly in the political margins?
Yeah. So I think that, Nagel and Tracy hit on this, and it's a point that a lot of leftists have a hard time coming back to, which is they say, we can't be satisfied with winning the ideological war. And they're right. They're right about that.
Right.
The key is that the argument from the other side shouldn't be, oh, we won the war of ideas, because that stuff can evaporate in a week. You know what I mean? Medicare for all right now is very popular. Obviously, we're in the midst of a pandemic, so it has a special appeal in the American public right now. But that kind of stuff can evaporate very quickly. All it takes is a really effective corporate media campaign, and suddenly Medicare for all is the least popular program in the history of the world. So there is a limit to what we can do with what some people call the Overton window. What's important for us is not, in my opinion, not so much the winning the ideological war, which is ephemeral. It's the political practice that we got through these campaigns, right? And I think it's really hard to claim that the number of people who are organizers, political leaders, trade unionists, people who are engaged politically have not been greatly benefited. 50 years of knowledge in 5 years on how to do politics in the real world with masses of real people connecting to real issues. Before this, the left was effectively isolated from all political practice. There was no meaningful left-wing political practice. It was going to a protest or, showing up at a picket line in solidarity, but there was no attempt at dealing with the question of the state. How do we wield it? What programs do we push? What do we do when we're trying to run for office? No one even thought about those questions. And if they did, they thought about them purely in the abstract because they had no real connection to it. So if we shift the grounds away from, oh, they won the ideological war, and instead say we are back into a connection with political practice that we haven't had in 50 years, that's a real thing. That is a real thing. And it's not a victory. Like, we don't have to sugarcoat it and say, oh, it's a victory that we're back in a political practice. But it gives us raw material, right? It gives us raw material that we haven't had in a long time. And nobody can pretend, no matter how much they're embittered by the defeat or whatever, nobody can pretend that their political lives are the same now as they were before Sanders ran. They can complain that we didn't win Medicare for all yet. They can complain that we weren't able to fit 70 years of social democratic reform into 5 years of campaigning. Sure, I'll concede. I'm surprised we didn't get Sweden out of 5 years of campaigning. But what they can't say is my political life is the exact same. I'm going to the same tiny little book club reading groups. I'm doing the exact same things as I was doing in 2015. It's just not true. There's a much bigger left public sphere. There's a much greater level of activity among leftists, among organizers, and among trade unionists than there were before 2015, before Sanders decided to run. So give credit where credit's due. It put us back in touch with reality. And it put us back in touch with an actually existing American working class that now we have the time to grapple with. Now we have the time to think about what that means and figure out how we actually build this thing for victory, right? So I think we should think about the Sanders campaigns as an experiment done on the American political, system. And the results of that experiment are we have a fair chance at getting pretty far in this thing if we play our cards right.
Right. And then that's also another reason why we got to, let go of all the stupidity and bad habits that are holding us back. But before we get to that, and then specifically the relationship with trade unionism, which is distinctly important and you can speak to.
You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.